Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with my three friends, Elizabeth Johnson, Erin Collins, and Quinn Galloway-Salazar. We're all collaborating on creating a compassionate communities model here in the US. You can go to the URL compassionatecommunities.us if you want to get some resources there and find out how to connect. We'll be telling you about a training that we have upcoming, and you can register for that at that URL, compassionatecommunities.us. I hope you enjoy this conversation. And make sure you subscribe to this channel down below if you haven't already. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. And go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're willing and able to make a small contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. So we'll move ahead with our four-way conversation about compassionate communities. Here we go. Today, I'm so happy and excited to welcome three guests to my podcast, all of whom have been on the podcast before. And we're really excited to talk to you about how we're collaborating together. And so I'm going to be introducing you to Elizabeth Johnson, Erin Collins, and Quinn Galloway-Salazar. To start with, Elizabeth Johnson is co-founder and executive director of the Peaceful Presence Project, a community-based organization in Oregon. With a master's degree in community and urban planning, she has traveled the globe as an educator and facilitator, awakening her fascination with the cultural and social contexts that shape human understandings of illness, grief, and death. She is a member of the Public Health Palliative Care International Leadership Council, as well as a board member for the Central Oregon Council on Aging. She's a graduate and current teacher for the Anam Cara Project with a focus on grief, loss, and resiliency. Elizabeth is passionate about integrating death literacy initiatives in local communities and encouraging honest dialogue around the complexities of the dying process. And next we have Erin Collins. Erin is the co-founder and program director for the Peaceful Presence Project. As a hospice nurse, she found that many of her patients arrived afraid of dying and largely unprepared for it, and decided to do something on the community level to ease this suffering. She trained as an end-of-life doula and earned a master's degree in nursing education with a heart for education in the community at all levels, including individuals, families, students, and clinicians in preparing for and talking about serious and terminal illness with compassion and tenderness. She serves as a vice chair of the NHPCO's End of Life Doula Advisory Council and is a member of the board of directors for the Oregon Hospice and Palliative Care Association. And finally, Quinn Galloway-Salazar is the founder of In Their Honor. She's an Army veteran, end-of-life doula, and educator. For over 20 years, she has dedicated herself to elevating the quality of life and overall well-being of military and veteran communities. Through her engagement in areas such as trauma, behavioral health, and suicide prevention, she has cultivated a profound insight into the enduring effects that military experiences can have on veterans and their loved ones. Her instrumental collaboration with the renowned PsychArmor Institute has led to the highly anticipated Caring for Veterans Through the End of Life series, which is a significant milestone in supporting veterans and their loved ones. In 2022-23, the Georgia Department of Veterans Services recognized Quinn as the inaugural Woman Veteran of the Year for her dedication to service. So I'll give you some websites now. You can learn more about Elizabeth and Erin's work with the Peaceful Presence Project at their website, thepeacefulpresenceproject.org. And you can view Quinn's course for care for veterans at the PsychArmor website, psycharmor.org. And Quinn's website is intheirhonor.info. So Elizabeth, Erin, and Quinn, thanks for being here and welcome.
Thank you for having us.
That was a mouthful to get through just to read those bios. But I thought maybe we should start out by we are the four of us are collaborators, and we've been working together for I think a year and a half now on a project, and that's what we've come here to talk about today. And it focuses on compassionate communities. We'll be explaining more about that. But I wanted to tell a little bit more about how we got together from different parts of the country and how that all happened. And for my part, I remember I did an interview with Ira Byock, and it was in June of 2022, I think. And we talked about the idea that we need a think tank to get together and work on these problems with hospice care that we're having. And so we use that term think tank. And Quinn, I wanted you to take it from there and talk about about your involvement in how we all came together.
Yeah, so I actually listened to that podcast and was like, wow, how awesome would a said think tank be? And I think somewhere in that time and space, you had interviewed both Erin and Elizabeth about the work that they were doing with compassionate communities. And I had bought the books, right? Started learning about what was happening um, over in the UK and in Australia with compassionate communities. And I'm like, well, who's doing it here? And then I realized Erin and Elizabeth was doing it here. So I reached out to them. I reached out to you. And then I'm going to throw it over to Erin and Elizabeth to kind of catch the container in how we all got to this place.
Mhm.
Yeah, I could start. I just remember listening to Quinn's interview with Karen. And I can't remember, I think we just realized it was like late 2021. And we heard that interview and I was just blown away. And I said to Elizabeth, this is amazing. And we posted it on our social media. We were so excited. Um, and then Quinn, like we reached out. I can't remember if Quinn reached out to us first or we reached out to Quinn first. And we were like, this is amazing. And yeah, it was just that connection around compassionate communities, and so great to hear somebody else with the same interest in this model. And so that's kind of how I remember it coming together. And then the whole think tank conversation came up, and I'm like, I'm just going to email everybody and got us all to have that first conversation. Elizabeth, what do you remember?
Yeah, very similar reflections on just the power of all of this, being here together today. I think a part of it was just this realization of where we geographically were all located and the representation of us being here on the West Coast in Oregon, Karen being sort of in the middle of the country, and then Quinn on the East Coast, and realizing that we just came from a real diversity of both lived experiences as well as geographies, and that really added to the richness of how we wanted to kind of come together and co-create something here.
It's
Yeah.
exciting for me because for a long time, I, as this podcast host, I recognize like what I really desired for the podcast is to become a networking hub where people could find one another who are doing interesting types of work. And it actually happened for me. I mean, I actually got to be involved, and my own podcast became a source of this group coming together to collaborate, because I'm such a firm believer that if we're going to tackle any of these end of life issues and social problems that we have, it will come through this kind of collaboration and working together, bringing our ideas together and our energy and experiences. And so it's been really fun to get to be part of a group that's actually working, sometimes in fits and starts, but actually trying to think of how we can improve things and make things better. And so for all of us are interested in um, the compassionate communities model. And we think we've been calling ourselves a think tank, which I'm not actually sure what that means. But I think we're still working on what is our identity, what are we going to call ourselves. But I'm just curious about how you all feel about our collaboration and how we're working together. And I don't know, Quinn, you kind of started this, I think. So if you have any thoughts about that.
You know, here's how I see this, right? Even this conversation that we're having, it feels like the sense of we're sitting around this virtual kitchen table and we're having this conversation that impacts not just us as end of life professionals, but impacts the world and everyone who is living. And so when I think about this think tank, we are four ideators, four dreamers that said, this is the what if future that we see. We all see ourselves and our community members playing an active role in end of life care. Now, how do we amplify that? How do we raise awareness to those needs? How do we do it in a way that we brought together a collective of four busy women from around the country where diversity, inclusion, all of the things play a part. But we said yes to the challenge. We said yes that we need to do more in how we show up in end of life care so that we can make a significant shift in the paradigm and how we show up for those in our communities at the end of their lives. So what it took was four fangirls of each other to say, we're going to put our egos, we're going to put our experiences, we're going to put our titles to the side for this greater good to shift what's happening in our country, stemming from the conversation that you and Dr. Bayek had. Where's the think tank? And we did that.
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts about our collective identity as we've come together?
Well, I love what Quinn just said. And I think that, sometimes when you think about a think tank, it feels sort of, it's in my mind, what comes up, it's cerebral, it's maybe more academic or research focused. You kind of wonder about the community-centered aspects of a think tank. And what I love that we're doing here is practicing together. There's an experiential element of what we're doing, which is this recognition, right? A compassionate community is a compassionate community because they've responded to the challenges and the assets that are particular to that environment and have come together and said, what else is here? What else can be done? And so what we're doing here together is not something that's prescriptive. We're not replicating what's happening in our respective communities, but we're saying we don't want to do this in a siloed way. Together, we're stronger, we're better, we're more inspired. How can we co-create and co-learn? And, from that vantage point, then say, what do we bring back to our communities and what's possible? And so I think that, the work here feels, it's trying to buck this idea that you just kind of do it in your own little siloed way and hope it works out. But we need to build these threads, this network between all of us, the four of us, and then beyond, and really have this inspiration point that grows into something else. So it feels like, to me, that's the heart of what we're doing here.
And Erin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what's, for me, I always am inspired by doing things differently. And I think each of us really stepped into kind of our respective work differently to inspire people. And so for me, I think that's similar to what Elizabeth and Quinn both said is it's like that, we said that the think tank isn't really what it is. That's too cerebral. It's more like we're a passion tank, right? We all have this passion for giving, re-empowering our fellow community members to be able to show up for one another and to take this responsibility, and that instead of being a system where somebody's become seriously ill or is dying and it's kind of like they go off, right? It's that one of those common misconceptions is, oh, I'm not going to go to hospice because that's where you go to die. I mean, that's really removing ourselves from the process and giving over to more of a paternalist system. And so the idea around the work that we're doing, and really me coming into this work several years ago, was how do we do this differently? And the way that we do it differently is in this compassionate communities model, really honoring what a community, however you define your community, what are the strengths of that community? what are all the skill sets? What are all the different perspectives that are brought within that community? And how can we empower and work together to do things differently for our fellow community members who are experiencing serious illness and death and loss? And I think each of us kind of had that same mindset. And so coming together and working to do it differently as a passion tank, so to speak, has been really inspiring for me. And as Elizabeth said, we're not here to create this prescription or even a outline of how other people do this. We're here to inspire others to think outside the box.
And that
Can
really we've come together with our differences, because each one of the communities we represent are very different. So we've been able to learn about each other's communities by going through this work together and applying it to our own community. And I think that that's been really helpful as well, to get a much bigger picture of what's happening um, in lots of communities around our country.
Mhm. I think we need to go on record and say it's a passion tank, right?
Mhm.
I love how you shifted the brain work, the head work, which is normalized as think tanks, to the heart work, which is passion tank. Um, I love that because it does something. It warms the heart, and it causes those other hormones in the brain to say, "Wow, we're serving," right? Um, Passion tank really feels, or it fuels us with compassion. I love that.
Yeah.
And I can say I'm somewhat new to the compassionate communities model, but the moment I heard the phrase compassionate communities, I knew, oh my gosh, that's what we need. We need compassionate communities. That needs to be our focus. So I feel like I'm still learning a lot um, about this model and the movement behind it. But I think, Elizabeth, you and Aaron have been working on this for a while. So I wonder if you would just explain to listeners what the compassionate communities model is, the two of you back and forth.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say about this model, the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. It's not one of those things where you kind of, you get the framework and then you've got all the information, you go from there. There's so much depth to it in terms of what it pulls in around, kind of the science around nervous system and human psychology and biology and belonging. And there's so much to this work, but to kind of try to pull in some of the core gems of why we're really moved by it. So the compassionate communities model of care is inspired by something that's known as public health palliative care. And this approach works from this understanding that illness and end-of-life experiences are social events or social experiences with medical components. For the most part, right, we've been taught to think that the inverse is true, that death and illness are medical events with these sort of secondary social components. But this model argues that the quality of the experience of someone who is navigating an end-of-life experience, the quality of the family or those caregivers who surround this person is really influenced or determined by the strength of the social networks that are in place, and by the general death and grief literacy or education for those that surround that person. One of our teachers, Dr. Alan Kelleher, oftentimes talks about the 95% rule, which is this understanding that research really supports that, for somebody navigating a serious or terminal illness, when you break down the hours in their day, you break down the hours in their week, typically only 5% of their time is spent face-to-face with a medical provider, with a medical professional. And so if we know, right, that this statistic means that their contact points with what we deem, these kind of supportive elements in their world is so limited, then the question is, right, what are we as communities doing with this other 95% of the time? And where and how are people supported and integrated into the larger fabric of the community? And so much of the science around this teaches us that, right, there are very severe implications when we navigate an experience and are very socially isolated or disenfranchised from the world around us, when we do not experience a sense of belonging. And for those that are navigating really serious sort of life challenges, that's unfortunately oftentimes the experience, is we kind of tuck them away in a corner and say, well, deal with that over there. We don't know what to do with this. And right, so research shows like comorbidities that accompany a serious illness, like anxiety, social isolation, disenfranchisement, et cetera, are really the things that are impacting somebody's experience more than anything. It is that social side of the navigation of an illness that's so impactful. So really this is about, the community is necessarily kind of needing to be viewed as a key partner when it comes to caring for those with a serious or terminal illness. And that's what a lot of our work is about. And, as we go through the conversation, we can share more examples about kind of what we're all collectively doing to touch upon that. Erin, what else would you add to?
Yeah, I guess I would just talk a little bit more around kind of when we look at this as a public health or population health approach to palliative care, what does that really mean? And ultimately, I think it means looking at some of the public health principles like health promotion and destigmatization. And if we look at this idea that, someone who has a serious illness or might be dying oftentimes does get stigmatized, or as Elizabeth said, put over here because we don't know what to do with them. And the idea is normalizing the fact that we are all humans. We are of the nature to grow old and become ill and to die. And in recognizing that and normalizing that, we recognize that someone is actually having a normal human experience when they navigate a serious illness or they come to the end of their life. And in doing so, that helps us to connect with one another and recognize, oh, I will have that experience too. And how do I support my fellow community member who's going through this normal human experience? They're not having something happen that is abnormal or is weird and we don't know what to do with it. We're humans and we do have a social obligation and a social experience around serious illness and around death and dying. And so to take this public health approach is to say, we are all going to have these experiences. This is what we can all do for one another. This is how we support one another and empower one another. And then we address some of these big public health issues that we're having now. The big topics right now are social isolation and loneliness and belonging, just like Elizabeth said. And so as we take a more public health approach, there's multi-sector collaboration that needs to happen. We're not saying that this is going to solve the world's problems outside of the healthcare system. This model says that in collaboration with the health system, the medical component, who provide that medical component, but what do we do socially to support one another? And how do we come together through health system and governmental and community organizations and faith organizations, all to provide the social aspects to support one another in these times of illness and loss.
I really love that. And last year, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Libby Solnow about the Lancet Commission report on the value of death. And one of the stories she told me, she spends so much of her time thinking about compassionate communities and working on the model and the framework and the big picture and looking at it. And she said she was feeling a little overwhelmed, like, how are we going to change my whole community? How are we going to do this? It's such a big task. And that she said that day she walked outside from her apartment and happened to look up and see an elderly neighbor who lived in her apartment building, but who was sitting on a little bench in front of the apartment all by herself. And she said she's walked past that woman a number of times before. And suddenly that day she realized, oh, this is how I do a compassionate community. And she went up and talked to the woman. They became friends. Now she checks in on her and calls on her and finds out if she needs anything from the store. And they just sit and chat sometimes and tell stories. And she said it suddenly became clear to me, like, the compassionate community is what each one of us chooses to do in the micro on our own, in our own world with what's around us, but we have to be aware of the concept and aware of the need for it before we'll notice the people all around us in our lives who could use that kind of support. Anyway, I loved that story so much, and it reinforced to me we need this education so that people can open their eyes and actually see where compassion is needed in their own communities.
I love, in communities, but also we live in this virtual world where we can do things virtually as well. Last year, I had the opportunity to journey alongside a woman veteran that lived further north than me. And she had brain cancer. And her family was really struggling with the fact that she had a terminal illness. And the day before she went to have her first surgery done, we did a video. We recorded this video. She wanted to share a bit about her life thus far. And she wanted to share her favorite songs, just in the event that during her recovery time, there were changes in her personality. She wanted there to be a gift of who she was, what embodied her life. And we did that. And it brings back that piece of belonging and connection, right? And so what happened after that, we would send video messages to each other through the course of the year. And I was getting ready to fly into LA for NWEL, and her sister sends me a message because when she went into hospice, she told her sister, "This is my friend Gwen. She accompanies me on this journey. Please keep her posted." Her sister would send me pictures of the room once she got into hospice, and we continued to journey together. And it went from here I am companioning and compassionately supporting my fellow woman veterans to now supporting her family as they're getting ready to navigate this loss. And it was beautiful because technology allowed us to FaceTime, it allowed us to record, it allowed us to do these things. And I was getting ready to get on the plane, and a sister sends me a message, and I'm making light of the situation. And she said, "Quinn, she just won't die. Her blood, her heart rate is this, and she's stubborn and she won't die." And I remember saying to her, she loved the song "A Lovely Day." Can you play "A Lovely Day" for my friend? And that night, I got the message that she passed away. But the beauty in the whole thing with compassionate communities and bridging the social isolation and the loneliness is being willing to show up, holding that space for someone who is terminally ill, knowing that they're going to die. And the lessons you learn from the dying on how to live is truly a gift in this work.
So true. And I'm wondering, or Elizabeth and Aaron, if you would want to share, well, first of all, anything about why you feel attracted to the compassionate communities model, like what it means to you. But also, we've been talking about how this model is something we can use to approach some of the major issues that keep arising here in our society around end of life care. And we already talked about social isolation and loneliness. But maybe Elizabeth, you could start and talk a little bit about how the compassionate communities model can help us when we're looking at other issues.
Sure. Yeah, and to your first question there, Karen, I mean, I think why this appeals to me, as we've all named, I think first it had this real heart appeal, right? The sense of, oh, to live in a world where people know how to companion, that we have this capacity, this competency to welcome, to belong, to notice, to pay attention, and I know through my own life loss experiences, I've experienced the opposite of that, where I found myself sort of emerged into this world where I was surrounded by a lot of people that just did not know how to do that with me. And so that was sort of the motivation to continue to follow this thread and say, what would this look like? And as I started out saying, you know, as I continue to dig in, I really feel like this is one of our best options, or kind of place of greatest hope or potential, to build these communities, right? Because it is rooted in this very profound scientific research that says, you know, we are social beings, we need one another, and that this isolation and disconnect have very significant physical implications. So it really bridges both these medical understandings of us as humans, as well as this social. And so, you know, one of the examples of the way that we've integrated this into the work of our organization, you know, we're a community-based organization. And as we started saying, you know, a lot of this work is about noticing what's going on around you, taking this very kind of asset-based and place-based perspective and saying, what needs to happen within a you know, community to create more end-of-life literacy, more potential, more care for humans who are living with serious or terminal illness. And so we live in Oregon. It's a very rural state. 27 or 26 of our 36 counties are considered rural or frontier. And so, you know, through our outreach, through our conversations with people, through our paying attention, what we've come to see is that there are a lot of individuals who are simply not supported when it comes to end-of-life care experiences. They're living in, you know, these service deserts where to access palliative or hospice care is really difficult. You know, people are either having to relocate, they're having to travel really far distances to get care, or they're simply not accessing it. Erin and I created material to train community members and professionals to the end-of-life doula skill set. Our work itself is really embedded within this compassionate communities approach, which is about bringing this practical wisdom and this competency to people to embed this understanding of how to work with companion others at end of life. In a diversity of ways, right? Either professionally, as a community volunteer, as a hospice volunteer, as a next door neighbor. And so we, you know, started looking at the reality of just so many rural dwelling Oregonians without this support. And so we applied for grant funding and have had a lot of success with foundations saying we get the value of bringing this work to rural Oregonians. As Quinn's story said, with, you know, the part of just, you know, kind of doing the paying attention in your community, and to your point, Karen, about Libby Salno, so much of this work is about having people have access to the skill set and then walking out their front door and saying, where does this need to be applied, right? Is this my next door neighbor? Is this, we had somebody who did our training who is an executive director for a rural food bank. She said, so many people come in the front door needing food, but they're also wondering what sort of resources are available. Do you know what palliative care is? You know, my grandfather's dying and we have absolutely no idea what to do. And that individual working in a food bank actually has the skill set now to say, sit down, let me talk to you about this. You know, I actually do know a thing or two. And not only do I know things, I know how to be with you in this really challenging experience. It doesn't scare me in the same way that it did before. I, you know, knew that I actually have a responsibility to myself and to my community to be somebody who's available in this way. So an example of just how we've chosen to embed some of this framework into the, you know, kind of real day-to-day work and the practicality of getting the skill set, this practical wisdom and this competency to people in our state.
That's a really beautiful example too of in the compassionate communities approach, in a way of assessing the community. Where are the needs? Where are the gaps, and what's missing in this community? And then what practical things could we do to address that gap? Because you're not going to be able to open a hospice or or get a palliative care provider to locate in those rural areas. There have to be other solutions that can still bring in the compassion and the care that is needed in that area. So I love that example. And I guess, Quinn, we were going to talk about your work with veterans and how, in a way, you've done the same thing. You've looked for gaps and come up with some solutions. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. One that always kind of sticks out in my mind for me, there's a group here in Atlanta, Georgia. They're called the Johns Creek Veterans Association. And last year, a member of theirs went into the hospital and his health declined extremely fast. And they were trying to figure some things out in terms of caring for his caregiver, supporting the family along the way. They were just trying to do the best that they could do in wrapping their arms around that family at the time. And the veteran in that organization that was in the hospital, his wife left one night, left the hospital to go home and get some rest. And unfortunately, that veteran died that night. So in our community and many other communities, there's this notion of no veteran should die alone. And they reached out to me and said, hey, Quinn, we heard what you're doing. We know that you're right here in Georgia. Can you help us? Because we don't want this to happen again on our watch. And so I said, sure, why not? So I went and I visited with them and I began training them with just practical ways, that active listening, that holding space, that understanding that there are unique experiences that veterans face at the end of life and how trauma plays a part, right? And so what started out with just a group of 13 veterans that primarily were Vietnam veterans is now turned into almost 30 volunteers in this community that are standing watch. They call themselves the 11th Hour Squadron, right? Which is so cool to me because they see this volunteerism approach as a way to give back. It's a form of second service to those that have served, right? And it's so beautiful because it allows them to continue to serve. It allows them to accompany their fellow veteran and having this understanding of what that experience is like to have served. But they're also supporting the caregivers and the loved ones with that approach by allowing them respite time, by allowing them to go take a shower, to get coffee, to eat, to do the things that we so take for granted, right? They are there to ensure that that caregiver and loved one is taking care of their needs. And kind of like what Erin and Elizabeth noted, it's practical strategies, right? It's showing up with a hot meal. It's cutting the veteran's hair. It's helping them clean up. Such practical things we can do to hold that space and to walk compassionately alongside that person that's terminally ill, but also their family. So it's really cool to see. As a matter of fact, this Sunday, I'm going to train their squadron with some new techniques and introduce their new volunteers to the work. But it's so cool to see that move. And that was the first place that I piloted that project. And there are a few other states. I went to Bend and I got a chance to hang out with Erin and Elizabeth and train up a few volunteers in Oregon on how to companion veterans. So it's we all come at this compassionate community space a little bit different, but at the core, it's that practicality of how do we show support? How do we show up in a way where families may feel so alone, but we see the need, we've assessed that there are gaps, and we're there to fill in those gaps, to plug those gaps with necessary and readily and steady support.
And you mentioned the issue of caregivers there, which I think is one of the other crises that we're facing that we really need a bigger vision for. We really need a bigger approach for in order to improve the situation for caregivers. And Erin, I wanted you to speak a bit about that.
Absolutely. Again, that was really one of the original things that brought me into this work was not only seeing the suffering for a person who was admitted to hospice who was unprepared, but the suffering that created in their greater caring circle. And so it's always felt important that we're looking at the caregiver as well. And I think if we go back to that 95-5 rule that Elizabeth mentioned, if the dying person is only seeing a healthcare provider 5% of the time, and they have a family caregiver, well, that family caregiver is probably also only getting like a 5% of their time, they're getting a break. And that's like maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours a week. And if they come to hospice, right, they might be able to get a volunteer, but that's often just a couple hours a week. And AARP did a report or released a report just last year talking about family caregivers. And I think their stats were from 2021, and it was like $600 billion worth of care is provided by unpaid family caregivers. Like 38 million people provide unpaid care for their loved ones. And that's not just people at the end of life, right? That's also individuals who have a chronic illness or a disability, but 60% of those people also work full-time or part-time. A lot of them might also be raising children while they're caring for an aging or ailing parent or family member. And then I think if we then add an end-of-life experience, somebody with a terminal illness on top of that, now that person has anticipatory grief of the loss. It's really remarkable that so many of these people say, yes, I'm burned out, but I wouldn't trade this. They really see the value in being with their loved one, but they also are providing all this care and, beyond just that person, all the other people, they're not caring for themselves. Sometimes they're neglecting their own medical appointments and medical needs. And so in this compassionate communities model, the help comes from neighbors and friends and volunteers who take on some of that burden and provide a little extra respite for those people, right? And so, how does the neighbor come over as you're taking your kids to school? Can the neighbor come over and prepare breakfast and sit for a while with the loved one? And, could a volunteer from the church come by and maybe pray with the person in their respective spiritual language? How do we all kind of recognize, and when we do become more interconnected and really recognize the normalcy of these human experiences, and we reconnect with one another, then we say, I've got an hour. Suddenly that person has 12 hours of respite from a few people in the neighborhood or in their circle. And that relieves some of the burden on the family caregiving. Now, that's not going to solve the problem in that, if somebody does need a more intensive level of caregiving, that right now they can't afford it. It doesn't solve that, in-home caregivers aren't paid enough. However, it could alleviate some of the suffering and some of the crisis level that we see just by having all of us say, oh gosh, I can do this. I've got an hour. I could go get a bottle of milk and bring it over while I'm doing my grocery shoppings. Hey, what can I pick up for you? And then that caregiver doesn't have to come up with a whole nother trip to the grocery store to get the few items on the way home from work and picking up the kids at daycare.
Mm. Yeah. Yes, I love that idea. And I was just thinking how the common thread that runs through these stories that we've been talking about and through looking at these issues like rural end of life care, like veteran care, the caregiver crisis, the common thread is education, as I see it. If we can help educate people in a community how they might step up, because Quinn, you found there were plenty of people willing to step up. They just didn't know how. They didn't have any training. They didn't know what to do or how, and maybe didn't see where the need was and how to get involved in. Same with the Peaceful Presence Project training, end of life doulas in rural areas. It seems like there are people willing to step up when the training's available, people actually want to have it and they're willing to help, but they never knew before how to do it or what to do. And so for me, it underscores what we need everywhere is education. And I think that's something Libby Salno uh, uh, emphasized too, is that the number one thing she would focus on is death literacy, death education. We need it everywhere in every community. And all three of you are doing really wonderful things in advancing death education in your own communities. And I commend you for that.
Well, likewise, Karen, I think you're doing a lot around death education as well, right? Your broader community, not just your local community, but this, this national and probably international audience that you have who gets the opportunity to listen in on these conversations and learn all the time. And so that's a really big initiative as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit vague in a way, like, because I don't set out to actually create students, but I'm hoping that disseminating information helps plant seeds and foster some of that growth in death education, because it seems to me it makes a difference when people are given tools and when they're able to recognize the problem in their own community and they're given tools. It seems like we're naturally compassionate beings. We actually naturally want to help other people, but if we don't recognize the problem or have any idea that we could help with it, we don't show up.
I think it's that recognition of I love the word intervulnerability that exists between all of us. And I think in places of illness, of death, of grief, that intervulnerability is so palpable and accessible. And once we really can feel into that, right, that sense of that opens, we have this true regard for what that means. And then you surround that with this education, with this death and grief literacy, with this sense of there are ways, there are tools. And there's, to all of our points, there's people that desire to be engaged in that way. And that's right, that experience of I'm doing this with others. I can do this with others. There's not one way to do this. What is needed, particularly here, just creates a real sense of potential that, I think especially now in the times that we live, in these very unprecedented times, people need that connection more than ever, that sense of empowerment, right? This is about empowering all of us with a sense of what it looks like to be involved.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it is it's empowering ourselves to be involved. And we often talk about we're not setting out to create a bunch of end of life experts. We're setting out to create end of life literate community members. And so that folks come to our trainings, not specifically to become an end of life doula, but to gain a set of skills for companioning the people in their lives, to go through these experiences. And it's really about, we talked about the service desert and in rural Oregon, and where we had a referral actually from a local palliative care physician who said, I've got somebody out in this community. Do you have anybody who's gone through your training who lives in that community? Because this 68-year-old person is taking care of their 95-year-old parent, and they don't have hospice in their community. And he's trying to do it alone, and he's doing a great job, but he could use some support. And it's not about, is there an end-of-life doula in that community? It's, has anybody gone through the training who might just have a little more skill set to go over and be supportive and kind of reassure him that, wow, you're doing a really great job. You've got this. Or, oh, what if we tried this? I learned a little something about this. What if we tried that? So that image of empowering ourselves and educating ourselves and creating more community members who have this idea that, yeah, we can do this. This is normal. We've got this.
Mm. Mm. I just love that. And I wanted to admit that when I started, excuse me, get some water here. For myself, when I started looking into the compassionate communities information, a lot of which comes from the UK, because that's where where it initiated, right? I felt a little bit overwhelmed because there's a lot of information and a lot of pieces to it and a lot of tools. And I sat down myself one day and thought, like, how do we make this accessible and simplify it in a way as a tool that can be utilized? And I thought back to something that I came up with a number of years ago, which I made up my own criteria for what I thought might be and what I called an end of life friendly community. And I came up with it because the community where I live in the mountains in Colorado, at one point decided it wanted to qualify to be classified as a bicycle friendly community. And the whole community was behind this. Would be a great idea. You actually get an official designation and you're on a website and you can put up signs in your community that says bicycle friendly. And so our whole community got behind it. We already had bike paths, but we built a lot more bike paths that were interconnecting throughout the county. We had bike shops opening up, rental shops, repair shops. We had bike parades began to happen every year, and this whole community-wide emphasis on bicycles and how we love bicycles and we love cycling and we encourage people to come here. Hotels started creating bicycle storage so that any guests they had who brought their bicycle could store it on site. All these changes just began happening all around us because as a community, we bought into the idea of being bicycle friendly, which we achieved and we got that designation. But I thought, what would it be like if we sought to become an end of life friendly community? What if everyone in the community bought in and that was their idea of how do we get this designation to be known as a community that's end of life friendly? So I made up, I made this up out of my own head. So it doesn't really have, it's not, I can't say it's validated or tested or anything, but these were my criteria. And for me, it fits in a little with the compassionate communities model of something attainable that we could strive to reach in our own communities. I'll just read off the 6 things that I came up with. First is having a community coalition to address gaps in care. And I think that's what Elizabeth and Erin, you've created through the Peaceful Presence Project. I think Quinn, you yourself are like the hub of a community coalition for veterans in looking at gaps in their care. And maybe my podcast in some way is my coalition, and the 4 of us are our own coalition. But at least a group in the community that would come together and really look at what are we missing, what is not here that we wish we had to help support people at the end of life. The second, that there is some form of community-based death education taking place. And that could even just be a death cafe or workshops on death or a book group on death that meets at the library, some form of educating the community around end of life issues. And number 3, that palliative care is available to whatever degree possible, that people can access some form of palliative care. And I realize that's hard in rural areas, as you were describing, but it might be that even through telehealth or telemedicine, there's some access to a palliative care consult. Number 4 is care and housing options for people at the end of life. And so making sure that there are places people can go at the end of life to make sure if they don't have their own caregiver, can they access a place where they could live safely in order to receive caregiving from someone else? And how do we address that problem? Number 5 was funeral and burial options that respect culture and the environment. That's something I see growing everywhere, green burial and home funeral options. But I feel like that's another aspect of the end of life that should be addressed in our communities, making sure that people have choices and can make choices for themselves. And then the last, healthcare provider training in end of life conversations and planning Is there anything available to encourage healthcare providers themselves to do a better job with how they talk to patients and help patients with their planning? So those were my 6 criteria that I came up with. And I'm offering those as my contribution in a way. It's nothing compared to what Compassionate Communities has come up with, which is so much more in depth and so much broader, but just as a starting point, I guess, that might be easier to grasp. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I
Well, I
do.
just, oh yeah, go Quinn. Yes, yes.
Elizabeth. As a PhD, as someone with a PhD, I always think about evidence-based practices, best practices, all those words in the research realm. What I love about the criteria is it normalizes this experience and it allows everyone to be able to feel like they can grasp it, right? And so I urge, right, like shouting from the rooftop, use the criteria because it's something that you can implement right now where you are, right? We don't need 10 years of implementation science to go behind it because you're having people die in your community every day, every hour. And just the call to action to do something. Look at this criteria. You may not get through all of them. Focus on one, focus on two, and watch how that is going to shift what's happening in your community. So, Karen, I hear you in saying it's not an official evidence-based practice or model, but boy, does it have the capability to do so much good right where we are.
I was going to echo that I think what's so tangible about the end of life friendly criteria is that there's something for everyone. There's a starting point for everyone. Like Quinn said, I don't even think you have to have 2. I think one of those could be where you fit in. You say, well, I'm an administrator for the local hospital. Sure, I can look into how all of our providers can have the skills to have these conversations and start these conversations. Gosh, I could look into, what are the local funeral and burial options? You could be a funeral provider, a funeral director in a community and say, could I be more inclusive? Could we be expanding our options? There's a place within each of those criteria for whoever you are in the community and whatever you do in the community to say, let's start here. And it might not be fast. And I think, Karen, you mentioned when you looked at the compassionate communities and you start to look at all the information and all the different projects, it doesn't have to be a huge initiative. It doesn't have to be a really well-oiled, well-organized program or project. It can just be one thing by starting a conversation, hosting, getting a bunch of people to sit together for a death cafe. It can be the simplest little starting point that really fuels a bigger exploration in these local communities.
And I was just going to celebrate the creation, the necessity of this criteria, Karen, by saying an example of what we've done with this is we've taken the set of 6 criteria and we've targeted the rural counties in Oregon. We've had a couple different public health interns who helped us to dig in and start looking at this criteria per rural county and say, what already exists, right? What in these sections, where could we start to fill this out and to celebrate the things that are already happening here? At the same time, it helps professionals, residents, those who are kind of doing the scan to say, and what's missing? And who might be interested in taking certain elements and kind of helping to do this research or to fill it out or to write your legislator a letter and say, we want more of something, we want more of this in our county. So again, it offers up a framework that's tangible and sort of a step-by-step thing that helps to kind of break it down into bite-sized pieces. And we're hoping, just in the case of our mapping, it'll live on our website. And somebody who lives in rural Wallowa County could come on there and say, what's happening? It's also going to be open source so that people can add to it as things grow. it's sort of this evolution of resources that'll be available. So it's an amazing criteria, and there's a lot that can be done with it.
And I can say I used it in my county, my bicycle friendly county, to kind of assess like where are we in this county, and discovered that our little cemetery outside of town is actually qualified to be, it could be a green burial ground, probably designated as that, something probably no one else knew that it could become a green burial ground if we wanted it to be. So it is like sometimes you find there are hidden gems right in your own community that no one knew about, and all we have to do is put the word out and let people know, and find who's interested in having this happen, to make some changes happen. And so that was kind of the fun part of doing this assessment and really looking at those areas to see what's available in the community. Harder for someone like Quinn, you live in a big city, so it's a little harder to take on that whole task. But
It's harder, but I think, like you said, picking one, right? And if you start off with just raising awareness and educating the community, that's a big one. Because when we start talking about death and dying, it's almost like there's still that stigma that's attached to it. So even if you start as broad as just education and death literacy, that's huge in a huge urban city. It's huge, and it moves mountains, right? Because what essentially happens is one community hears that you've done it, then another one reaches out, and it's almost like you threw a pebble out there, and here's this big ripple effect that's happening where people are saying, okay, we want to learn too, and we want to be prepared as well.
And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what's out there right now. If someone listening is interested in the compassionate community model and is wondering, what could I do? How could I get more into this material? So maybe we could talk a little bit about what's out there. I know, Quinn, for one thing, there's your training through Psych Armor for caring for veterans that's available.
Yeah, and so let's celebrate for the moment that all four of us joined hand in hand on creating and designing that work. And so we all partnered with the Psych Armor Institute in coming together and forming a collection of courses called Caring for Veterans Through the End of Life. And the very first course is focused specifically on compassionate communities. So often I hear people say, thank you for your service, thank you for your service. And then I hear people say, we want to put action behind saying thank you for your service. And so that was kind of the idea behind having one course specifically on how community members can show up for veterans and their loved ones through the end of life. So I am always in awe that you three ladies joined me along some other amazing end of life professionals to create and to share your stories and your experiences with working with the veteran population and how we can show up compassionately.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Quinn, for that. It's amazing, the courses that you've created. And I can leave a link to those in the show notes. And you and I did an interview last fall about about your courses as well, that people can go back and listen to. And then Elizabeth, tell us a little bit more about the training and networking available through PHPCI.
Sure. So PHPCI is Public Health Palliative Care International, and I recently went on the Leadership Council more than anything, just because we wanted to have sort of US representation on the council. As we've alluded to a couple of times, there's been more traction, more momentum in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, and less so here in the United States. So really wanting to put ourselves on the map and be a part of the conversation. So PHPCI is a combination of practitioners, academics, researchers, et cetera, that have come together from different countries. We've got India, Kenya, Canada, US, Australia, UK represented. And it's a really great resource for people just to start to kind of engage in the conversation and see what's out there. I think Karen will put in the show notes, PHPCI has a really great resource page that's sort of a curation of different compassionate community kind of movements or frameworks that people might start thinking about. We're lucky enough that this the public health palliative care sort of movement has been happening long enough. So there's actually now sort of community assessments and evaluation tools available to see what it would look like to embed this in a community, to do sort of that scan of where might you want to start. So there's a lot out there. It can be overwhelming, but also want to mention that we also want to be resources, and we'll include contact information as well to reach out directly to us to engage in the conversation.
And Erin, anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think like Elizabeth was just saying, I think you can absolutely use us as resources, any of us. And we also have a website, compassionatecommunities.us, and it's a clearinghouse for information to we've kind of curated what we feel are some of the best, most tangible resources for folks to use. And so all the links that we've mentioned today and some more will be on that site, as well as contact information to reach out to us. But we hope that'll just feel like a starting point for folks to learn more about education, to learn more about all of the end-of-life friendly criteria. What do you do if you're picking one of those criteria to start? At compassionatecommunities.us, there will be some more resources for how to get started.
And we have a handout, right, for this episode. I mean, people can download right from the show notes page,
yes,
a handout. So maybe you could tell them what will be on the handout.
Yeah, so we'll have the working kind of what we consider our passion tanks working definition of compassionate communities. It'll have the end-of-life friendly criteria, as well as the website to go and get yourself started.
And so beyond that, first of all, compassionate communities itself it's a much bigger topic than we're able to really cover in depth in this 1 hour. So we've decided to put together, the 4 of us, a training for people who want to learn more about compassionate communities and really go deeper with that. So I don't know, chime in if you want to say anything about that, but our training session is going to go live May 1st. And it's free. It will be available for people to learn more in depth about compassionate communities, all the things that we couldn't really cover in our time frame today. And so anything else anyone wants to say about that? We haven't actually recorded it yet at the time we're recording this, so we know it's going to be really good. We just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that, it'll be pre-recorded, but then we are going to have an opportunity to engage as well afterwards. And I don't know that we have the date for that yet, but it'll be announced. And obviously getting in touch once we have the information. It'll be in the show notes and on that compassionatecommunities.us, how to RSVP or register for that training session. So
yeah, and as we said, it's free. So if you think you're interested, go there now and get your name on the list, and then you'll be notified as soon as it's available, and also notified. So we're doing a live Q&A session after people have had time to go through the training. The 4 of us will be on a call where you can ask us questions online. So compassionatecommunities.us is the URL to go to get all this information. The handout for today will be on the show notes page also, so people can download it from there. Anything else that that you all want to say that we haven't covered yet?
I think we covered a lot.
But we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did.
But I think if there's anything that you get from this juicy but passionate conversation, I hope you're inspired to do something. Hope you walk away with saying, oh, I can do that right where I am with the skills that I have, or I can get someone to join me and we can do that. Sometimes it takes one, and then it comes two, and then three, and then four. And before you know it, you have that coalition right in your community. Be inspired to do something.
And that's a great call to action, Quinn. So I'd say as well, go to compassionatecommunities.us. Take a look at what we have for you there and register for the in-depth presentation on compassionate communities. So thank you. Thank you, all three of you. It's been so much fun to record this conversation together.
Thank you, Karen.
And we've really actually had a really great time the last year and a half with our coming together, and sometimes stalling out a little bit and then getting reinvigorated and excited. And we made it through a lot of different life events that have happened for all of us. And here we are. So we're excited to still be moving forward and able to offer this to other people.
Yeah, likewise.
All right. Well, take care. I hope you enjoyed that conversation about compassionate communities and what our passion tank is doing to help promote the model here in the US. And you can go to compassionatecommunities.us in order to learn more and get some resources and download the handout from this conversation. So remember, I'll be back next week with another conversation. And until then, take care and be well.